Michael Landon, The Pain That Created Pa Ingalls. The Night Nobody Knew. May 9th, 1991. Michael Landon walked out onto the stage of The Tonight Show. The audience rose to their feet. He smiled, crossed to his chair, and within minutes the studio was filled with laughter. He was cracking jokes, teasing Johnny Carson, playing a prank he had clearly planned ahead of time. A fake restaurant menu filled with dishes made from cat meat, a callback to an old inside joke between the two men. The audience had no idea what was happening behind that curtain, because behind that curtain, medical staff were standing by. They had just finished administering medication to keep him stable enough to sit in that chair for the next 30 minutes. Michael Landon was dying. Pancreatic cancer, final stage. His doctors had given him weeks, not months, and he spent those weeks making strangers laugh on national television. If you want to understand why a man facing death would choose to do that, you need to go back. Not to Hollywood, not to Bonanza or Little House on the Prairie. You need to go back to a small house in Collingswood, New Jersey, and a little boy named Eugene. Eugene, the boy nobody saw. October 31st, 1936. Eugene Maurice Orowitz was born in Forest Hills, Queens, New York. His father, Eli Orowitz, worked as a publicist for movie theaters. His mother, Peggy O'Neill, was a dancer and comedian of Irish Catholic descent. On paper, it sounded like a creative, lively household, the kind of home where stories were told and laughter came easily. The reality inside that house was something else entirely. When Eugene was 4 years old, the family moved to Collingswood, New Jersey, a working-class suburb dominated by Protestant families where Jewish residents were not particularly welcome. Eugene was bullied relentlessly by classmates for being half Jewish. To prepare for his bar mitzvah at Beth Shalom Temple, he had to ride his bicycle to a neighboring town every day to learn Hebrew, because Collingswood offered him no space for that part of who he was. Outside the home, he was an outsider. Inside the home, things were worse. His mother suffered from severe depression and emotional instability, a condition that in the 1940s had no name that anyone spoke out loud, no treatment that anyone offered, and no mercy. She had recurring suicidal thoughts. She and Eli fought constantly, and there were stretches, not days, but weeks, where the two of them did not exchange a single word. Eugene and his sister Evelyn grew up reading the temperature of every room they walked into, checking every facial expression, listening for every shift in tone. The home that should have been the safest place in the world was the most unpredictable one. Under that kind of sustained emotional pressure, something happened to Eugene's body that he could not control. He developed chronic bedwetting that lasted until he was 14 years old. Doctor today would recognize this immediately. It is a well-documented physiological response to chronic anxiety, a nervous system that never gets to fully rest, a body that cannot fully let go even in sleep. It was not weakness. It was not laziness. It was what happens to a child who is never, ever allowed to feel safe. His mother did not see it that way. Instead of taking him to a doctor, she took the wet bed sheets and sleepwear and hung them outside his bedroom window, visible to neighbors, visible to friends, visible to every classmate who walked past the house. A public punishment for a private suffering. Eugene developed a brutal routine in response. Every morning, before his parents woke up, he would quietly gather the evidence, skip breakfast, and run through the empty streets to the nearest laundromat. He would wash everything, dry everything, fold everything, run back home, and arrive at school on time. Every single day. No one knew. Looking back now, that daily run was the first chapter of his survival story. A boy teaching himself that when the world humiliates you, you don't collapse. You get up before dawn, you solve the problem yourself, and you show up. You always show up. But survival is not the same as healing, and what happened one afternoon at the beach made that distinction permanent. During a family vacation, after an argument, his mother walked into the ocean. She was not swimming. Eugene understood what she was doing. He could not swim. He went in anyway. He pulled her back to shore. He set her down on the sand. She stood up, brushed herself off, and walked away without a word. No acknowledgement, no thank you, no moment of looking back at her son who had just risked his own life for hers. She simply walked away, as though nothing had happened. Eugene sat on that beach and became physically ill from the shock. Decades later, when he was one of the most famous men in America, when his face had been on the cover of TV Guide 22 times, when millions of families watched him every week as the warmest, most loving father they had ever seen on television, Michael Landon still called that afternoon the single worst experience of his entire life. Not because of the danger, because after everything, no one looked back and said, "You were brave. I'm sorry. I love you." Those words were never spoken. He spent the next 30 years of his career saying them to everyone else. The javelin, the name, the beginning. There is a moment in almost every difficult childhood where something unexpected breaks through the darkness. For Eugene Orowitz, that moment was a javelin. In 1954, at Collingswood High School, the skinny, angry kid who had been overlooked his entire life uncovered something nobody predicted, including himself. He could throw. Not just well, extraordinarily well. With a borrowed javelin, throwing on pure instinct and fury, Eugene launched a throw of 193 feet and 4 inches, just under 59 meters. It was the longest high school javelin throw recorded anywhere in the United States that year. A full athletic scholarship to the University of Southern California followed. For the first time in his life, Eugene Orowitz was seen. Not for what he came from, not for what he looked like in the morning, not for who his parents were, but for what he could do. That lesson embedded itself permanently. Capability is the one thing no one can take from you. USC lasted 1 year. A serious shoulder ligament injury ended his athletic career and dissolved his scholarship in the same moment. He dropped out. He cycled through jobs, a soup factory, a ribbon warehouse, eventually a gas station positioned conveniently close to the Warner Brothers studio lot. Then came a moment so small it barely registered at the time, but changed everything. His father, using an old contact at RKO Radio Pictures, arranged to bring Eugene to the studio lot for a meeting, a potential opening, a first step. They arrived at the gate. The security guard looked at his father and turned them away. No meeting, no exceptions, no entry. Eugene watched his father's face go red with embarrassment, watched him turn around without a word, and made a decision that had nothing to do with acting and everything to do with who he refused to become. He would never again stand on the outside of a gate waiting for someone to let him in. He would find a way to hold the keys himself. Through a casual introduction at a Warner Brothers acting class, he was noticed by a casting agent. The agent told him the industry would struggle with his name. Eugene Maurice Orowitz did not fit on a marquee, and it carried a weight that Hollywood in the 1950s was not always ready to carry. Eugene opened a local phone book, closed his eyes, pointed randomly, and landed on 2 words: Michael Landon. He didn't choose the name because it sounded glamorous. He chose it because it had no history. No bedsheets hanging in windows, no beach, no silence from a mother walking away. Michael Landon was a blank page, and Eugene Orowitz was finally going to write something worth reading. His first significant break came in 1957, the low-budget horror film I Was a Teenage Werewolf. The role required him to play a troubled teenager being consumed by something he couldn't control, running from a version of himself he couldn't escape. He was extraordinary in it. It was not difficult material for him to access. By 1959, at 22 years old, he was cast as Little Joe Cartwright on a new NBC Western called Bonanza. Nobody thought it would last. Bonanza, The First Family. Bonanza launched in the fall of 1959 in what NBC considered a graveyard time slot, Saturday nights, when viewership was expected to be low. The premise was simple enough. A widowed father and his 3 sons running a vast Nevada ranch called the Ponderosa, navigating the moral complexities of frontier life. It was the first Western to broadcast in full color, and for the first 2 seasons, it struggled. Then something shifted. By 1964, 60 million people were watching every week. Bonanza was the #1 television show in the entire world. Michael Landon played Little Joe, the youngest, the hothead, the romantic, the one who got into trouble and somehow always found his way back. He was shorter than his co-stars, 5'9" compared to Lorne Greene's 6 feet and Dan Blocker's 6'4", and he wore lifts in his boots during outdoor scenes. But what he lacked in height, he made up for in a quality that cameras find irresistible. Genuine feeling that reads as completely unguarded. But what happened on that set went far beyond performance. Lorne Greene, who played the patriarch Ben Cartwright, was in his mid-40s when the show began. Steady, warm, and deeply comfortable in his own authority. Off-camera, Landon found himself drawn to Greene in a way he hadn't anticipated. He would go to Greene with personal problems, sit with him between scenes, ask for advice. The dynamic between them off-screen was nearly identical to the one they portrayed on it, a young man finding stability in an older man's presence. It was the first time in Michael Landon's life that an older man had simply been available, consistent, safe. Dan Blocker, the enormous, gentle hoss Cartwright, became something close to a brother. They ate lunch together daily. They pulled elaborate pranks on guest actors. They complained together about weak scripts and laughed together at everything else. The bond was genuine, protective, and full of the kind of easy affection that Landon had never experienced growing up. He had found a family. It happened to be fictional on screen and completely real everywhere else. Then there was Pernell Roberts. Roberts played Adam Cartwright, the eldest son, the intellectual, the one who had studied architecture back east and returned to the Ponderosa carrying books and principles. Off-screen, Roberts was a classically trained stage actor from the East Coast theater world, who arrived at Bonanza already deeply skeptical of the television industry's capacity for serious storytelling. He found the scripts shallow. He believed the show was reinforcing racial stereotypes in its portrayals of Native Americans, Mexican characters, Chinese characters, and he fought loudly and consistently for something more honest. The producers largely ignored him. His co-stars, including Landon, found his complaints disruptive to the working environment. In the early seasons, Roberts made pointed remarks about Landon's acting that Landon felt as genuine condescension. The relationship between them remained professional but cold. In 1965, Roberts walked away. The show was still ranked #2 in the country. His salary was equivalent to nearly $1 million per episode in today's terms. He left anyway. Landon watched all of it, and he arrived at a conclusion that would define the next 3 decades of his career. Roberts was right about the problems, but walking away from them hadn't changed a single thing. The show continued. The scripts continued. The only thing that changed was that Roberts spent the next 14 years largely unemployable, blacklisted by NBC in retaliation. If you want the story told correctly, Landon understood, you cannot leave the room. You have to become the person who controls what happens in the room. He started writing. His first script for Bonanza, called The Gamble, was returned to him covered in corrections. Too short, grammatical errors throughout. He rewrote it. Then he wrote another. He began staying on set after his scenes finished, watching the director's work, asking questions about camera angles and shot composition. He sat with editors. He studied producers. Over 14 seasons, he wrote 21 episodes and directed 14. He was building an arsenal. He just hadn't found the right war yet. In 1972, Dan Blocker died suddenly of a pulmonary embolism. He was 43 years old. Without its gentle giant, Bonanza's ratings collapsed. NBC canceled the show that November. The producers asked Landon to write and direct the final episode, to close out 14 years of television history. He did it. He sat in the director's chair and brought the story of the Ponderosa to its end. Then he stood up, walked off that set, and started building something new, something completely his own. Little House, building what he never had. In 1974, producer Ed Friendly purchased the rights to the beloved series of autobiographical novels by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Stories about a pioneer family surviving and thriving in the Minnesota frontier during the 1870s and 1880s. Friendly approached Landon to direct the pilot film. Landon read the material and agreed, with a single, non-negotiable condition. He would direct the pilot, and he would play Charles Ingalls, the father. Friendly's vision for the project was grounded in authenticity. He wanted the harshness of frontier life preserved, the poverty, the weather, the unpredictability of survival. What Landon wanted was different. He wanted to make a show about a family where people communicated, where they stayed together not out of obligation, but because they genuinely chose to, where a father was emotionally present, physically available, unashamed of his love for his wife and children. He said it plainly in interviews. His own family had been the opposite, full of religious tension, judgment, and suffocating silences that nobody was allowed to break. He wanted to create the families on screen that he had never been part of in real life. Friendly gradually stepped back from day-to-day production. Landon stepped forward. By the time Little House on the Prairie premiered on NBC in September 1974, he held 5 roles simultaneously: executive producer, head writer, primary director, and lead actor. He was 37 years old. The casting process for the central role, young Laura Ingalls, who would become known as Half Pint, brought dozens of girls through the audition room. When 9-year-old Melissa Gilbert walked in and was asked about the height listed in her file, she simply placed her hand flat on top of her own head and said with a small, unself-conscious smile, "About this tall." No performance, no attempt to charm, just herself. Landon knew immediately. He quietly set aside every other audition tape and submitted only Gilbert's tape to the network. He did not believe in leaving important decisions to chance. What happened next on that set became something that everyone who worked there eventually described in the same way. It felt real. Landon had a specific technique he used with the child actors during emotionally demanding scenes. He would not ask them to perform grief or fear or love. Instead, before the cameras rolled, he would crouch down to their level, look them directly in the eyes, and say, quietly, "Do you have any idea how much I love you?" Melissa Gilbert later described how the line between Michael Landon and Charles Ingalls simply disappeared in those moments. The tears that followed were not acting. They were real, because something real had been offered. Consider that for a moment. The boy who sat on a beach waiting for a word that never came had found a way to give that word to someone else, over and over again. Through 9 seasons and more than 200 episodes, the show ran from 1974 to 1983 and became a cultural institution far beyond the United States. Families in dozens of countries gathered around televisions every week to watch the Ingalls family face hardship with grace, argue and forgive, cry and laugh, and always, always choose each other. But behind the camera, not everything was what it appeared to be. Karen Grassel, who played Caroline Ingalls, Ma, spoke publicly years later about what happened when she requested a salary increase commensurate with what other lead actors on top 10 shows were earning. It was a reasonable request. The show was a massive commercial success. She was its female lead. Landon's response was not negotiation. Her screen time began to shrink. Scenes that had included her were rewritten to leave her out. In some episodes, camera angles were deliberately composed to keep her face off-screen, even when she was technically present. She described feeling trapped, unable to leave without damaging her career, unable to stay without enduring treatment that grew more marginal with every season. If you know what you now know about Michael Landon, this is not difficult to understand. It is also not excusable. A man who had spent his entire childhood with no control over anything, who had learned that survival required total self-sufficiency, who had built his entire career around the principle of controlling the material, perceived a financial negotiation as a threat to the structure he had constructed around himself. His response was instinctive and disproportionate. The wounds that made him great also made him capable of causing harm. Pa Ingalls would never have done what Michael Landon did to Karen Grassel. That gap between the man on screen and the man behind the camera was real, and it mattered. There was another gap that mattered more. In 1976, at the height of Little House's popularity, Landon wrote, directed, and starred in a television film called The Loneliest Runner. The film told the story of John Curtis, an Olympic gold medalist in the marathon who looks back on a childhood defined by chronic bedwetting and his mother's systematic public humiliation. The story was autobiographical in nearly every detail. He took the secret he had carried for 20 years and put it on national television. Not as confession, as art. Because making it into a story was the only way he knew to stop it from being a wound. That same year, and in the years that followed, his marriage to his second wife, Lynn, was quietly coming apart. He was working 14-hour days. He was writing through the night. He was directing, producing, managing a crew of hundreds and a cast of children who needed his emotional presence. By the time he came home, there was nothing left. In the early 1980s, it became public that he was having an affair with Cindy Clerico, a young makeup artist on the Little House set. The scandal was significant, not just because of the affair itself, but because of the contrast it created with everything he represented on screen. Melissa Gilbert, who had spent years treating him as a surrogate father, was deeply shaken. They did not speak again for years. He married Cindy in 1983. He defended the end of his marriage not with apology, but with a kind of blunt honesty. 19 years together had produced wonderful children, but two people had simply grown in different directions. He was not wrong. He was also not entirely honest with himself about the cost. His son, Michael Landon Jr., who later became a successful producer and director himself, struggled significantly in the years after his father left the family. He dropped out of college and battled alcoholism through his teenage years. His daughter Leslie developed a serious eating disorder. Years later, Michael Jr. put it on record that his sister had somehow convinced herself that if she became thin enough and beautiful enough, their busy, famous father might finally pay attention. The man who created a television father that an entire nation called perfect had replicated, in quieter ways, some of the emotional absences he had grown up in. In 1999, Michael Landon Jr. wrote and directed a television film called Michael Landon, The Father I Knew. It was not a hatchet job. It was something harder than that. An honest account of what it had felt like to be the real child of the man who played America's ideal father. The film ended with forgiveness. It took years to get there. Little House on the Prairie ended in 1983. NBC canceled it without the courtesy of a formal conversation with Landon. After nearly a decade of delivering enormous ratings and cultural impact, the network simply announced its decision and moved on. Landon wrote and directed the finale. In the story, the town of Walnut Grove is seized by a railroad corporation, and the residents, rather than surrender what they built to someone who never earned it, blow it up. Every building destroyed. The sets, where hundreds of people had worked for 9 years, gone in a single controlled explosion, with one take to capture it from every angle. The cast stood together and watched their second home disappear. Melissa Gilbert called it the longest funeral she had ever attended, but Landon gave the order to leave one building standing, the schoolhouse, the church, the same building. Every other structure on the Walnut Grove set was reduced to rubble. That one remained.
Because some things, the place where children learn, the place where people reach for something larger than themselves, are not allowed to be destroyed. The boy from Collingswood knew that better than anyone.
Highway to Heaven and the final chapter.
In the fall of 1984, Landon created Highway to Heaven, the only show in his career where he owned 100% of the rights from the beginning. In it, he played Jonathan Smith, a probationary angel sent by God to walk the roads of America and quietly help people in crisis. His partner was a skeptical, gruff former police officer played by Victor French, one of his closest friends from the Little House years. The idea had come to him during an ordinary Friday evening commute. He was driving through Beverly Hills to pick up his children, stuck in traffic, watching people in expensive cars honking at each other, yelling, cutting each other off with genuine fury. He found himself thinking, why are people this angry? If they spent the same amount of time and energy simply treating each other decently, the whole line would move faster. Everything would work better. It was the same question Eugene Orowitz had been asking since childhood, watching his parents sit at the same table and refuse to speak. Highway to Heaven was his attempt to keep answering it, one story at a time. From 1985 onward, he made a practice of bringing actual cancer patients and people with disabilities onto the production, not as props or background details, but as participants. Some wrote scripts, some appeared in episodes as themselves. The show addressed terminal illness, addiction, domestic violence, the loneliness of aging, and racial prejudice with a directness that primetime television rarely attempted. For Landon, the screen had never been just entertainment. It was the only place he had ever fully known how to say what he meant. The last performance. In early 1991, Michael Landon had just received a Lifetime Achievement Award from NBC and was developing a new series for CBS. He was 54 years old and, by every outward appearance, in the middle of a strong professional renaissance. During a family ski trip to Utah, he began experiencing severe, unrelenting headaches. The tests came back in April 1991, inoperable pancreatic and liver cancer, already metastasized. The 5-year survival rate for pancreatic cancer at that time was between 1% and 4%. His doctors recommended chemotherapy. After trying several doses and observing the limited benefit alongside the profound suffering, he declined to continue. He switched to an intensive alternative regimen, strict diet, meditation, 13 glasses of organic juice per day, a daily schedule built entirely around managing his body's remaining strength. His doctors were not all in agreement with these choices. He made them anyway. On April 8, 1991, rather than allow tabloids to break the story first, Landon called a press conference at his 10-acre Malibu property. He walked out to meet the reporters himself, and then, In front of cameras broadcasting to a nation that was about to be devastated, he made a series of jokes. He riffed about rumors that he wanted to father a 10th child before he died. He talked about fighting the disease with a kind of competitive relish that seemed almost physically impossible given his condition. He told the assembled press, "If you want to keep living, if you want to beat something, you cannot do it from a corner. You cannot huddle and wait." The boy who learned before he was 10 years old that a smile is the one thing no one can take from you had never unlearned that lesson. 1 month later, on May 9, 1991, he appeared on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. It was his final public television appearance. The medical team was backstage. They had administered medication before the taping to give him enough stability to complete the segment. His face was thinner. His body had changed visibly in just a few weeks. He walked out to a standing ovation, sat down across from Carson, and launched into an elaborate prank, a fake menu from a restaurant where every dish was made from cat meat, a callback to a decade-old joke between the two of them. The audience laughed until the studio shook. 60 million people had once watched him on Bonanza. Tens of millions more had watched him raise half-pint through every crisis Walnut Grove could produce. Millions had watched Jonathan Smith walk the roads of America, doing small, quiet acts of grace. And now they were watching him sit under studio lights, cracking jokes, making sure that this, whatever this was something they could carry with them without only grief. He was doing what he had always done, giving the audience what they needed instead of what he felt. The cameras did not show what was behind the curtain. They never did. The last words, by his family. His son told him quietly, by his family. His son told him quietly that it was time, that it was all right to let go. Landon looked at the people around his bed, and he said, "You're right. It's time. I love you all." Then he added one more sentence, the last thing he said. "Just love each other." That sentence, 4 words, was everything Eugene Orowitz had ever wanted to hear. From the woman who walked away on the beach, from the family that sat in silence, from the house that should have been safe and wasn't. He never received it. But he said it, with his last breath, to the people who had managed to stay. Former President Ronald Reagan, in a public statement following Landon's death, said that Landon's battle with cancer had touched the heart of every American, as had his indomitable spirit. His funeral was private, attended by 500 people. Melissa Gilbert, who had not spoken to him for years after the Cindy affair and had reconciled with him only near the end, stood before the gathered mourners and said, "He was so special and so basically good. With him, you always knew exactly where you stood. The man had integrity." The legacy of the wound, love and laughter. There is no mention of love and laughter. There is no mention of Eugene Orowitz on that stone. No mention of the wet bedsheets. No mention of the laundromat at dawn. No mention of the beach or the silence that followed, or the boy who sat in a small cave reading comic books and dreaming of a different life. But if you know that story now, if you carry it with you, then the next time you watch Pa Ingalls kneel down beside his daughter and speak to her with his whole heart, you will hear something underneath it. Not a line from a script, not a performance. You will hear a man giving away, over and over again, across 30 years and hundreds of episodes, the thing he was never given himself. Michael Landon did not create Pa Ingalls from imagination. He created Pa Ingalls from the hollow place inside himself that had never been filled. And in doing so, in pouring that particular wound into that particular character and delivering it into the living rooms of millions of American families every week for 9 years, he filled something in all of them instead.
That is the legacy, not the ratings, not the 22 magazine covers, not the awards or the production credits or the empire he built from a phone book and a javelin and sheer, relentless will. The legacy is this: a boy who was never told he was loved, spent his entire life making sure that everyone watching felt exactly that. And if you grew up watching Little House on the Prairie, if you sat with your family on those Thursday evenings and felt, without quite knowing why, that something warm and true was being said to you through the screen, now you know where it came from. It came from Collingswood, New Jersey. It came from a beach where a woman walked away and a boy sat alone in the sand. It came from the pain that created Pa Ingalls.